Most people treat solitude like a punishment. The moment silence arrives, they reach for their phone. They fill every empty hour with noise, other people's opinions, social media feeds, background music, anything to avoid the one voice they fear the most, their own. We live in a world that has convinced us that being alone means something is wrong with us. That if you spend a Friday night by yourself, you must be lonely. That if you don't have a packed social calendar, you must be failing. That if you enjoy your own company, something must be missing in your life. But what if I told you that everything you've been taught about solitude is completely backwards? What if the very thing society has conditioned you to run from, the quiet, the aloneness, the stillness, is actually the most powerful state a human being can inhabit? The Stoics knew this. They discovered it centuries ago and built entire philosophies around it. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the Roman Empire, retreated into solitude every single morning before dawn, not because he had to, but because he understood something most people never figure out. That the man who cannot be alone with himself is a slave, and the man who masters solitude masters everything. This isn't a video about isolation or loneliness. This is about something far more powerful. The deliberate, strategic, deeply misunderstood practice of chosen solitude, and how it is, without question, the single greatest advantage you can develop in a world of noise, distraction, and shallow connection. If you've ever been told you're too quiet, too independent, or antisocial for needing time alone, this video will completely reframe what that means about you. Because what they called a flaw, the Stoics called it the foundation of mastery. Stay until the end, because the final insight in this video might be the one that changes how you spend the next decade of your life. And before we begin, if you find value in what we're building here, take 1 second and subscribe. It costs you nothing. It means everything to the people who haven't found this content yet. Let's go. Number 1. Solitude is where your identity is forged. Here's something almost nobody talks about. The reason most people don't know who they are, what they truly want, what they genuinely believe, what actually makes them feel alive, is because they have never spent enough time alone to find out. Think about how you grew up. You were shaped by your parents' expectations, then your school's rules, then your friends' opinions, then your partner's preferences, then your employer's demands, then social media's standards, layer after layer of other people's voices piled on top of you, until the original signal you became almost impossible to hear. This is not an accident. Society rewards people who conform. It gives approval to those who blend in, who follow the script, who take the accepted path. And so most people never stop long enough to ask, is any of this actually mine? The Stoics were obsessed with this question. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, a book he never intended anyone to read, a private conversation with himself. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Those weren't words written for an audience. They were written in solitude, for himself alone. The most powerful man in the known world kept a private journal because he understood that without that internal dialogue, without that daily excavation of self, a man loses the thread of his own identity. Think about what that actually means. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire. He commanded armies. He had advisors, senators, generals, and philosophers surrounding him at all times. And yet, the most important conversations he had were the ones he had alone, with himself on the page. Epictetus understood this even more sharply. He had nothing. He was born a slave. He owned almost no possessions. And yet he said, he is a wise man who does not grieve for the things which he has not, but rejoices for those which he has. That clarity, that absolute certainty about what mattered, didn't come from other people. It came from radical self-examination. It came from solitude. Now think about two people who have both just gone through a major life disruption, a breakup, a job loss, a failure. The first person cannot sit still. They immediately call friends. They go out, they stay busy, they are on their phone at every possible moment. They surround themselves with distraction because the silence feels unbearable, like if they slow down long enough, something terrible will catch up with them. 6 months later, they make the same choices. Enter the same relationships, repeat the same patterns, because they never stop to examine the root. The second person does something different. They sit with the discomfort. They create space. They spend evenings alone, not wallowing, not spiraling, but thinking. They examine what happened, what role they played, what they actually want versus what they thought they wanted, what beliefs were driving their decisions. Slowly, something clarifies. An identity solidifies, not the one handed to them by others, but one they chose. 6 months later, this person is unrecognizable, not because their life changed, because they changed. That's what solitude does. It is not emptiness, it is excavation. So, how do you begin using solitude to forge your identity in real life? First, build what the Stoics called a daily retreat. Even 15 minutes alone each morning before the phone, before the news, before any other voice enters your space. In that time, ask yourself one question only. What do I actually believe today? Second, start writing to yourself. Not a diary of events, a dialogue with your own mind. Ask hard questions. Challenge your own assumptions. Write down what you want, and then question whether you actually want it or you were told to want it. And finally, stop apologizing for needing time alone. That need is not a defect. It is the signal of a person who is serious about who they are becoming. Your identity is not handed to you. It is built, and it is built in solitude. Number 2, silence gives you an edge that noise destroys. There is a reason the most dangerous people in any room are usually the quietest ones. Not dangerous in a threatening way, dangerous in the way that a chess grandmaster sitting across from you, saying nothing, studying everything, is dangerous. You feel it, that stillness, that coiled certainty. They're not performing for the room, they're processing it. Most people do the opposite. They talk to feel relevant. They share every thought the moment it arrives. They announce their plans, broadcast their ambitions, perform their emotions in real time, and in doing so, they drain the very energy those plans require to materialize. The Stoics had a word for this kind of undisciplined self-disclosure: distraction. Epictetus warned his students, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." That wasn't just advice about conversation. It was a philosophy of strategic restraint, of understanding that your words are a resource, and like any resource, spending them carelessly makes you poor. But here's the deeper truth that most self-improvement content misses entirely. Silence doesn't just save your energy, it multiplies it. When you stop the constant output, the posting, the talking, the announcing, something remarkable begins to happen beneath the surface. Your mind, no longer occupied with performance, turns its full attention toward processing. Ideas that had no space to form begin to crystallize. Insights that were drowned out by noise rise to the surface. The mental clutter clears, and what remains is sharper, more focused, more powerful. Think of it like this. A lake that is constantly stirred up by wind and rain is murky. You can't see the bottom. You can't see what's moving beneath the surface. But a lake that sits undisturbed, perfectly still, that water becomes clear all the way to the bottom. You see everything. Your mind is that lake. Marcus Aurelius practiced what historians call the view from above, a Stoic technique where he would mentally step back from the noise of his daily life, wars, politics, personal losses, and see it all from a distance. From that elevated silence, the right action became clear, not because the problems disappeared, but because he was no longer standing inside the noise of them. Now think about 2 people, both trying to solve a creative problem at work. The first person talks about it constantly. They bring it up in every meeting. They share half-formed ideas as they arrive. They ask everyone for input and end up with 10 conflicting opinions that pull them in different directions. They feel productive. They are not. They've outsourced their thinking to the room, and the room gave them chaos back. The second person goes quiet. They don't announce they're working on it. They think. They walk alone. They sit with it. They let the problem breathe inside them without rushing toward a solution. And then often unexpectedly, often while doing something completely mundane, the answer arrives. Clear, whole, and theirs. That second person isn't smarter. They're simply more silent. And silence is a skill. History confirms this pattern with eerie consistency. Newton developed calculus during a plague quarantine when Cambridge University was closed, and he was forced into solitary retreat at his family home. Darwin developed his theory of natural selection during long solitary walks on what he called his thinking path. Einstein famously said that his best thinking happened during his long, solo violin sessions, not in the lab, not in conversation, but in the private world of sound and solitude. These weren't coincidences. They were the predictable results of minds given space to work without interruption. Seneca wrote, "Retire into yourself as much as possible." He wasn't prescribing hermitage, he was prescribing discipline. The discipline of creating silence deliberately in a world that profits from your distraction. So how do you build the edge that silence creates? First, institute a daily period of deliberate silence. Not passive silence, forced silence. Phone off. No input. Just you and your mind working together. Start with 30 minutes and protect it like it's sacred, because it is. Second, stop announcing your goals. The research on this is counterintuitive and powerful. When you tell people your goals, your brain registers the social acknowledgement as partial achievement. The motivation to actually do the work decreases. Silence around your ambitions doesn't just protect them from other people's doubt, it protects them from your own premature satisfaction. And finally, practice active listening instead of performance speaking. In your next conversation, speak 30% less than you want to. Watch how much more you notice. Watch how much more powerful your words become when you finally use them. Silence is not absence. It is presence so concentrated that the room reorganizes around it. Number 3, solitude destroys approval. Addiction. Here is one of the most uncomfortable truths in this entire video. Most of what you do every single day is not for you. It's for an audience that isn't even watching. The clothes you wear, the car you drive, the opinions you share, the way you speak in groups. The subtle performance of your daily life, most of it is engineered, consciously or not, for the approval of others. And that engineering has a cost, a heavy one, because every time you edit yourself for external approval, you move slightly further away from the person you actually are. The Stoics called this the greatest form of slavery. Not chains, not poverty, but the condition of needing others to validate your existence. Marcus Aurelius, surrounded by flattering senators and generals who told him exactly what he wanted to hear, wrote this to himself. "It never ceases to amaze me. We all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own." Read that again. The most powerful ruler in the Roman world saw approval-seeking as a paradox of self-betrayal. You love yourself most, yet live for others' judgments. How does solitude fix this? Because approval addiction is fundamentally a relationship with other people's attention. And when you spend meaningful time alone, truly alone, with no audience, you begin to discover something disorienting at first and then deeply liberating. You are still you without the audience. Your preferences exist without anyone confirming them. Your ideas have value without anyone applauding them. Your worth does not fluctuate based on how many people saw your post today. But this only becomes real through experience. You cannot think your way out of approval addiction. You have to sit your way out of it. In the solitude, the hunger for validation will arise. You'll feel the pull to check your phone, to reach out, to see what people think. And each time you sit with that hunger without feeding it, something shifts. The grip loosens. Not all at once, but steadily, reliably, permanently. Think about two people building a business. The first person makes decisions based on what looks impressive. They post about every milestone before it's real. They choose strategies based on how they'll sound in conversation rather than whether they'll work in practice. They're performing entrepreneurship as much as practicing it. When they hit a difficult stretch with no wins to show, they fall apart because their confidence was always borrowed from external feedback. The second person works in quiet. They make decisions based on their own analysis, their own values, their own long-term vision. When people don't notice their work for months, they don't spiral because their sense of direction was never dependent on outside confirmation. They trust their own judgment. That trust was built in solitude, through thousands of quiet decisions made with no audience watching. That second person builds something real, because they built themselves first. Epictetus said it directly. If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. That is the price of independence from approval. You stop curating. You stop performing. You stop making yourself palatable to everyone in the room. And yes, some people will find that unsettling. Good. That discomfort is the wall that separates those who are living their own lives from those who are living for the approval of others. The Stoics understood that the man who needs nothing from the crowd is the most powerful man in it. First, audit your decisions this week. For each major choice, ask, am I doing this because I want to, or because of how it will look? The answer will reveal more about where your power is leaking than almost anything else. Second, spend one full day offline. Not a digital detox performance you post about afterward, a genuinely private day of no input and no output. Notice what arises. Notice what the silence tells you about how much of your energy lives in other people's perception. And finally, practice making small decisions based on your own preferences alone, with no explanation or performance. Order what you actually want. Wear what actually fits who you are. Speak the opinion you actually hold. Small acts of self-loyalty in private compound into an unshakable identity over time. Solitude doesn't make you indifferent to people. It makes you free of needing people in order to know who you are. Number 4. In solitude, your discipline becomes unconquerable. There is a quality that separates people who consistently achieve from people who consistently almost achieve. It's not talent, it's not intelligence, it's not even work ethic in the way most people think about it. It's the ability to do what needs to be done when no one is watching. Think about that carefully. Almost everyone can perform discipline in public. When there are eyes on you, a trainer watching, a boss expecting, a partner checking, showing up is relatively easy. Social pressure is a powerful motivator, but remove the audience, remove the accountability partner, remove the external consequence, and then watch what happens. Most people stop, not because they're lazy, but because their discipline was never truly theirs. It was borrowed from the environment, and borrowed discipline collapses the moment the environment changes. The Stoics had a name for the kind of discipline that doesn't require an audience, virtue, and they considered it the only form of discipline worth cultivating. Seneca wrote, "Pursue what is right, not what is easy, and you will find that hardship itself becomes your teacher." The Stoics trained themselves to do the difficult thing, especially when no one was watching, precisely because that was when character was actually built. And here is the connection to solitude that most people never make. Solitude is the training ground for private discipline. When you practice showing up for yourself alone, when you wake up early with no accountability partner, when you exercise without anyone to impress, when you do the deep work with no one to validate the effort, you build a kind of inner discipline that is completely independent of external conditions. It becomes yours, structural, unshakable. Consider two athletes. The first trains primarily when observed. They push hardest when the coach is on the field, when teammates are watching, when there's competition to measure against. Alone in the gym at 6 in the morning, they cut corners. They negotiate with themselves. They do enough to feel like they did it, but not enough to actually grow. Over time, their performance has a ceiling set precisely at the level their external discipline can reach. The second athlete does something different. They train as intensely alone as they do when observed. Not because someone is checking, but because they've made a private covenant with who they're becoming. Each solitary session is a vote cast for the person they intend to be. Over time, that internal standard becomes higher than any external standard ever placed on them. They surpass the first athlete, not in a dramatic moment, but quietly, gradually, inevitably. The compound effect of private discipline is the most underestimated force in human achievement. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect." That self-respect, that internal honor, is built in private. It is built in the moments when you keep your promise to yourself, even when breaking it would cost you nothing in anyone else's eyes. Those moments, stacked over time, create a person who is incapable of being owned by circumstance. But let's be honest, private discipline is hard, harder than most people admit, because the negotiation happens entirely in your own mind. Without the friction of a witness, the temptation to compromise is always present. The Stoics had a technique for this. They called it premeditation of action, essentially deciding in advance, with full commitment and no exception clauses, what you will do. Not, "I'll try to wake up early, but I wake up at 5. That is not a decision I make each morning. It was made once. The elimination of daily renegotiation is what makes private discipline sustainable. First, identify one commitment you currently keep only when someone is watching. Make a decision a real one, unambiguous and non-negotiable, to keep it in private. Hold it for 30 days. What that 30 days does to your self-concept cannot be overstated. Second, create what the Stoics called a private standard, a personal code of conduct you hold yourself to, regardless of what anyone around you is doing. Write it down, return to it. Let it be the measure by which you judge your days, not anyone else's opinion. And finally, understand that every act of private discipline is a withdrawal from the approval economy and a deposit into your own sovereignty. The man who can hold himself accountable in the dark is unstoppable in the light. Number 5, solitude teaches you to think. Really think. Here is something alarming. Most people have not had an original thought in years, not because they aren't intelligent, but because original thought requires something that modern life has systematically eliminated: uninterrupted mental space. We are consuming at a rate that would have been incomprehensible to any previous generation in human history. News, opinions, podcasts, videos, social media, messages, a continuous stream of other people's processed thoughts poured directly into our minds from the moment we wake until the moment we sleep. And in that flood, our own thinking, quiet, slow, generative, gets completely washed out. The Stoics were building their philosophy in a far less distracted world, and even then they considered uninterrupted thinking rare enough to be treated as precious. Imagine what they would say today. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. Not the quantity, not the speed, the quality. And quality thinking requires something that quantity thinking destroys: silence, space, and the willingness to sit with a single idea long enough to see where it actually leads. Real thinking is uncomfortable. It moves slowly. It leads to uncertainty before it leads to clarity. It asks you to hold contradictions, to examine assumptions, to follow an argument somewhere you didn't expect to go. It requires you to stop being passive and start being active in a way that consumes real mental energy. This is why most people avoid it, not deliberately, but by staying perpetually distracted. A mind in constant consumption never has to think, it just reacts. And a mind that only reacts never creates. It only repeats. Think about two people being given the same information, let's say a book about strategy and business. The first person reads it while commuting, absorbs the highlights, feels vaguely informed, and moves on to the next piece of content. 2 months later, they can barely remember what they read. The information passed through them without sticking because they never stopped to actually think about it, to connect it to their situation, to challenge it, to sit with the parts that confuse them, to ask, what does this mean for me specifically? The second person reads the same book, but then they put it down. They go for a walk. They sit with the ideas in silence. They ask themselves hard questions about the arguments. They disagree with parts of it out loud to themselves, testing their own objections. They think not just about the book, but through the book, using it as a starting point for their own genuine intellectual processing. 6 months later, the second person doesn't just remember the book, they have integrated it. Their thinking has permanently changed. And here's the compound effect: they now think more clearly, more originally, more confidently across every other domain of their life. Because thinking is a skill. And like every skill, it develops through practice. The practice of solitude is the practice of thinking. Epictetus said, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." You cannot embody a philosophy you haven't actually thought through. You cannot act from clarity you've borrowed from someone else's words. Genuine wisdom, the kind that shows up in your actual decisions under pressure, only comes from your own encounter with the ideas, alone, without an audience, in the forge of your own mind. The most dangerous people in any intellectual arena, the ones who cannot be easily manipulated, who cannot be talked out of their positions by social pressure, who cannot be confused by clever rhetoric, are people who have done their own thinking in solitude. Their positions aren't performances. They are conclusions. They've been tested internally before they were ever expressed externally, and they hold. First, choose one idea or question that actually matters to you. Not an abstract philosophical concept, but something with real stakes in your life. And commit to spending 30 minutes thinking about it alone, with nothing to write on and nothing to read. Just you and the question. Notice what emerges. That emergence is your real mind, not the curated version you present to the world. Second, read less and think more. This is counterintuitive in a culture that prizes consumption. But one book genuinely thought through is worth 10 books passively absorbed. After every significant thing you read, build in time to sit with it in silence before moving to the next thing. And finally, start asking yourself why, more aggressively, not just about the world, but about your own positions, your own preferences, your own certainties. The Stoic practice of Socratic self-questioning, asking why you believe what you believe until you find the bedrock or the gap, is one of the most powerful intellectual tools ever developed. And it only works in solitude. Number 6, alone is where your purpose becomes clear. Here is a question that most people never sit still long enough to actually answer. What do you want your life to be? Not what your parents hoped, not what your culture suggests, not what your social media feed implies. What do you, the person who will live with the consequences of your choices for the rest of your life, actually want? Most people are living someone else's answer to that question, and they don't realize it because they have never been truly quiet long enough to hear their own. This is the deepest work of solitude. Not the discipline, not the thinking, not the identity building, although all of those matter profoundly. The deepest work is this: discovering what you actually want your one life to be about. Aristotle called it eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but more accurately translated as living in alignment with your deepest nature. He believed that every human being has a specific nature, specific gifts, specific callings, and that genuine fulfillment only comes from living in alignment with them, not from external achievement, not from social success, from alignment. You cannot find that alignment in a crowd. You cannot hear that call over constant noise. It requires silence. It requires patience. It requires the willingness to sit with the uncomfortable in-between space where you don't yet know the answer and resist the urge to fill that space with distraction. Seneca wrote with devastating clarity, "It is not that I am brave enough to face death. It is that I have wasted so much time that I no longer fear it, for I have already not truly lived." That is not a quote about mortality. It is a warning about directionlessness, about living in reaction rather than in purpose, about spending years in motion without ever asking where you're actually going. Think about two people in their mid-30s. Both have achieved what looks like success from the outside: career, relationships, stability. But something feels hollow. The first person takes that hollowness as a sign of ingratitude and pushes it down. They go busier, more ambitious, more distracted. They remodel the house, chase the next promotion, plan the next trip. The movement is real, the progress is real, but the hollow feeling never actually leaves because it was never addressed. It was only avoided. 15 years later, the hollow has become an ache that no achievement can touch. The second person does something terrifying. They stop. They take a week alone. Not a vacation, a retreat. No agenda, no entertainment, just space. The first few days are uncomfortable. The mind rattles and demands stimulation. But by day 4, something shifts. The real questions begin to surface. What actually matters to me? What am I building this for? What kind of person do I want to be when none of this is performing for anyone? What would I do if success and failure look the same from the outside? Out of that silence comes not a dramatic revelation, but a quiet clarity, a direction, a North Star that belongs entirely to them. That clarity becomes the most valuable thing they own. Because every decision afterward, every opportunity accepted or declined, every relationship cultivated or released, every morning's first hour spent is oriented by it. Their life stops being a reaction to external events and becomes the expression of an internal vision. That is not a small thing. That is everything. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "A man's life is a mere moment, his existence a flux, his perception clouded, his body's composition corruptible." So, what can guide us? Only philosophy. He didn't mean academic philosophy. He meant the private, rigorous, daily practice of asking, what matters and how should I live? That practice lives in solitude. First, block 24 uninterrupted hours alone every quarter. Not to rest, not to be entertained. To think about your life at the macro level. To ask the questions that daily life makes it too easy to avoid. Treat it as a board meeting with yourself, the most important one you'll ever attend. Second, write a personal philosophy, not borrowed from anyone else, your own. What do you believe about how life should be lived? What do you value? What are you willing to sacrifice? What are you not willing to sacrifice? Writing this in solitude and returning to revise it as you grow becomes the compass that no external crisis can take away. And finally, ask yourself the Stoics' most clarifying question. If I were to die in 10 years and had full knowledge of that fact, what would I change? Whatever your honest answer is, that is what matters most to you. That is the thread of your purpose, and it was always there, waiting in the silence. Number 7. The person you become in solitude is the person the world cannot ignore. Here is where everything comes together. We have talked about identity, about silence, about freedom from approval, about discipline, about thought, about purpose. And you might be wondering, what does all of this actually produce? What is the result of choosing solitude deliberately, consistently, and courageously in a world that pushes endlessly toward noise? This is the result. You become someone who is built from the inside out. In a world full of people who are assembled from borrowed opinions, curated performances, approval-seeking decisions, and outsourced thinking, a person who is genuinely, deeply formed from the inside is extraordinary. Not because they are dramatic or loud or impressive, precisely because they are not. They are calm when others are reactive. They are clear when others are confused. They are consistent when others fluctuate with every new opinion. They do not need the approval of the room because the room is not their compass. They are not shaken by rejection because their value was never in others' hands. They are not paralyzed by failure because their identity is not attached to any single outcome. This is what the Stoics were building in themselves. Not a cold, unfeeling stoicism, but an integrated self. A person whose inner life and outer life are the same. Who needs no performance because there is no gap between who they are and who they show up as. That person radiates something that cannot be faked, bought, or manufactured. It can only be grown in solitude, over time, through the unglamorous and deeply rewarding work of knowing yourself. Marcus Aurelius was called the philosopher king, not because he wrote beautiful philosophy, but because he governed from it. Because the clarity he built in his private journals translated directly into the wisdom and restraint with which he led. His solitude did not isolate him from the world. It made him profoundly, uniquely suited to serve it. Seneca wrote, "I am not born for one corner. The whole world is my country." He could say that, mean it, because he did not need any particular corner to validate his existence. He carried his home inside him. Think about the person you respect most. Not the loudest person you know, not the most prolific on social media, not the most socially busy. Think about the person whose judgment you genuinely trust, whose presence makes you feel steadier, whose life seems to have a kind of coherence and direction that others lack. Almost certainly, that person spends real time alone. They have a relationship with their own mind. They have an inner life that informs their outer one. They were built in the quiet, and it shows not in what they say, but in the quality of who they are. That is available to you right now, not as some distant achievement, but as a practice you can begin today. Epictetus, who began his life as a slave with no possessions, no rights, no certainty of survival, became one of the most influential philosophers in history, not because of what he accumulated, because of the quality of his inner world. He said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." That mastery begins in solitude. It begins when you stop looking outward for what can only be found inward. The world is not short of people who are busy. It is starving for people who are clear. The world is not short of people who are loud. It is desperate for people who are grounded. The world is not short of people who are connected. It is longing for people who are genuinely present. Those qualities, clarity, groundedness, presence, are forged in silence. They are the product of the hours you spend alone, not scrolling, not consuming, not performing, but actually living in the full dignity of your own consciousness. So how do you begin building the person the world cannot ignore? First, choose 1 hour each day that belongs entirely to you, not to productivity, not to others, to the practice of being alone with yourself and building your inner world. Guard it, defend it. This is the hour your future self will thank you for. Second, stop treating solitude as something that happens to you and start treating it as something you choose. Plan it, protect it, create environments that support it. The relationship you build with your own mind will outlast every other relationship in your life. Treat it accordingly. And finally, understand this. The noise will always be there. The invitations, the distractions, the pressure to be perpetually connected and available, none of that is going away. But neither is the silence, if you choose it. And in that silence is a version of you that is calmer, clearer, stronger, and more alive than the version that has been shaped by everyone else's expectations. The Stoics didn't preach solitude because they wanted you to be alone. They preached it because they wanted you to be free. And freedom, real freedom, the kind that doesn't depend on circumstances, begins the moment you are no longer afraid of your own company. You are not missing something because you prefer silence. You are not behind because you need time alone to recharge. You are not failing because you don't feel the need to be constantly surrounded. You are, in those moments of chosen solitude, doing the most important work of your life. Go be alone, on purpose, powerfully, and watch what you become.